Welcome to the Sociology of Race. What is race? Race is a symbolic category based on phenotype or ancestry and constructed according to specific social and historical contexts that is misrecognized as a natural category. Now let's unpack the different parts of this definition. Race is a symbolic category. This means that racial categories are socially constructed. As a society, we create them. They are often created at particular moments in time. For example, at one time, the racial category Native American did not exist before non-Native Americans came to the United States. There were various tribes and peoples, such as Choctaw, Sioux, Navajo, etc. Now we have a larger umbrella category, Native American, that includes all of these groups. Race is also based on phenotype and ancestry. Phenotype refers to visual markers such as skin color, eye shape, nose size, hair texture, etc. We often use these markers to group people into particular racial categories. Sometimes those who are mixed race, for example, are not easy to racially classify. This often makes people uncomfortable when they cannot, quote, figure out what race to assign individuals. And in society, we often do not allow for those who are mixed race or multiracial to identify as such. We often insist on using phenotype to assign people to a racial group. This also relates to the idea of ancestral background playing a role in race. In the United States, we have the one-drop rule. This rule refers to the idea that if you have any African ancestry in your background, then you are considered to be black. We take this rule very seriously. In 1982, Susie Gilroy Phipps, a blonde-haired, blue-eyed woman, discovered that on her birth certificate she was classified as black. This was due to a Louisiana rule that stated that anyone who was 1/32nd black, regardless of what they looked like, was legally black. Susie Gilroy Phipps was the great-great-great-great-grandchild of a white Alabama slave owner and his black mistress, and even though all of her other ancestors were white, Phipps was considered black. Phipps sued for the right to be considered white and lost. This law was eventually done away with in 1983, but this case stands as an example of the significance of ancestry when defining race. Race is constructed according to specific social and historical contexts. For example, in South Africa, there was once a rigid apartheid system, which was a system of racial segregation between black and white South Africans. Under the apartheid system, there were three racial categories: white, black, and colored, which included all mixed-race people. Apartheid has since ended, and now more recently, the black category has expanded to include all groups who were oppressed under apartheid, not just those of African heritage, but Indian and Chinese South Africans as well. So we can see racial categories and who they include can shift or change depending on social and historical contexts. Finally, race is often misrecognized as natural. People often think that race is rooted in biological differences between different groups. There are a few genes that give us our skin color, eye shape, hair texture. However, studies have shown that there is more biological differences among people of the same racial groups than between. For example, a person from Sweden could have more genetically in common with a person from Ghana than they might have with another Swedish person. In addition, society assigns racial categories based on phenotype. However, this is an arbitrary distinction. Why not assign races based on foot size, arm length, or ear shape? Instead of having only a handful of racial groups, why not have 100 racial groups? The idea is that when you think about it, there's really nothing natural about race. As a society, we socially construct these categories and make them what they are. So far, we've seen that race is a relatively arbitrary category. It's a social construction, and it's changing and fluid. So giving these various elements of race as a category doesn't matter. Think about this for a minute. Consider some of the ways that race might matter and shape people's lives, even though it is a socially constructed category. How might it shape the types of privileges a person might have? Might race influence someone's ability to get a job or buy a home? However, some people argue that our society is post-racial and that we should operate from a colorblind perspective. Post-racialism is the idea that society has moved beyond race, that racism and racial discrimination no longer exist. Related to the concept of post-racialism is the issue of colorblindness. This is a racial ideology or way of thinking that expresses itself in seemingly non-racial terms. These non-racial terms mean that basically it's the status of people of color. Explaining the status of people of color is due to market dynamics, naturally occurring phenomena, and cultural limitations. In other words, racism is perceived as irrelevant and virtually ignored when we talk about why some groups have been able to do better in areas such as employment or education than others. Sociologist Eduardo Bonilla Silva discusses how the idea of colorblindness is executed through several frames or ways of talking or not talking about race. Abstract liberalism is the first one. Considering race, for example, in college admissions or employment, the idea of considering race is unfair because everyone should have, quote, equal opportunity. This uses equality language, claiming that all groups should be treated the same way. However, not all groups have had the same starting line, possess the same amount of power or privilege. Cultural racism. This is analogous to blaming the victim. It's basically saying that a lack of effort, loose family organization, and inappropriate values are what is to blame. This idea blames racial groups for their lack of social mobility. For example, Latinos do not value education, which is why they tend to have low graduation rates. Related to cultural racism is the minimization of racism. This is the idea that racism is not at work. It must be a group's culture, poverty, etc., anything but contemporary forms of racism. For example, making a statement like black people do not live in this neighborhood because they are poor and can't afford to live here minimizes the role that racism plays in housing. Many blacks and other people of color who seek to buy homes in particular neighborhoods are steered away from them by real estate agents. Historically, there were also racial covenants, which were laws that prohibited builders and realtors from selling homes to blacks and other people of color. Redlining practices also routinely denied blacks loans to obtain homes in predominantly white neighborhoods. We can think of institutional racism as a system that privileges whites and oppresses non-whites. Think of this as related to issues of domination and power along various dimensions. There's the symbolic, the idea of classifying one group of people as normal and other groups of people as, quote, abnormal. The political, withholding basic rights from people of color and enforcing segregation and inequality. The social, denying people of color full inclusion or membership in life. Think about how many people of color, regardless of how long they might have lived in the U.S. or if they were born here, are still considered, quote, foreign and not American. The economic. Whites are often privileged in terms of job placement, advancement, wealth, and property accumulation. In conclusion, I would like you to brainstorm how racism can take place in the following institutions: the media, healthcare, education, criminal justice system, employment, and housing. How might groups of color not have access to representation or opportunity in these institutions?